Upper House is a center for gathering and learning here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, curating experiences of Christian thinking, being, and doing. At the crossroads of intellectual inquiry, spiritual growth, and civic engagement, we extend hospitality and offer programs for individual, communal, and societal transformation. It is our honor to be partnering with the Loka Initiative tonight in hosting this conversation on creation care, climate change, and healthy discourse in Christian communities. 3 years ago, we co-hosted our first event together with Catherine Hayhoe in April of 2019, and it is a delight to be working together again. I now want to introduce Tequila Changyalpa, who will be moderating our program this evening. Tequila is the director of the Loka Initiative, an innovative education and outreach program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for faith leaders and culture keepers of indigenous traditions. Its mission is to support faith-led environmental efforts locally and around the world through collaborations with faith leaders and religious institutions on environmental protection, sustainable development, and global health issues. Prior to that, she was the recipient of the McCluskey Fellowship at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, where she also lectured and researched. Tequila also founded and directed Sacred Earth, an acclaimed faith-based conservation program at the World Wildlife Fund from 2009 to 2014. She was the WWF U.S. Director for the Greater Mekong Program for 5 years before that, and also worked for WWF in the Eastern Himalayas. Please join me in welcoming Tequila Changyalpa to the stage.
Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you so much for coming out in Wisconsin November weather, which means we have no idea what to expect. I guess before I start, I would like to start by paying my respect to the Ho-Chunk Nation, in whose ancestral lands the Loka Initiative was born, here in Madison, Wisconsin. This land is covered with 1,500 year-old effigy mounds. It is sacred to the Ho-Chunk people. They called it Dejop, which refers to the 4 lakes that surround Madison, so the 4 sacred lakes. The Ho-Chunk people were forcibly removed from this land in 1832, but they returned, sometimes in small groups, sometimes in single digits, and they returned, and we honor their resistance and their determination to restore the land that they belong to. As Melissa mentioned, the Loka Initiative is an interdisciplinary capacity building and outreach platform at UW-Madison. It is made up of 8 different university centers, departments, schools, including the Center for Healthy Minds, which is where we're hosted and taken care of, the Nelson Institute, and the Global Health Initiative. Currently, Loka works with 3 different faith communities. So that's evangelical church leaders and preachers. We work with the pastors through a partnership with Arosha, Care of Creation, and World Evangelical Alliance. We work with indigenous elders, including with the Menominee Indian tribe and the Ho-Chunk tribe here in Wisconsin. And we work with Tibetan Buddhist monastics in the Himalayas. I've been told to take a moment and tell everyone that Loka is hiring, so I think there is a QR code that will go up. And so for anyone that's looking for a job that's interested in religious studies, environmental education, equity, justice, climate action, please send this forward. So I often get asked what made me work with faiths, right? Why did I decide all of a sudden from this very environmental science background to work with faiths? And there are many transactional reasons. So 80% of the world population subscribes to a faith. Faiths collectively own 8% of all habitable land. 50% of schools worldwide are run or managed by faiths. Collectively, faiths are the 3rd largest financial investor in the world. So there are all kinds of transactional reasons for us to work with faiths, right? They're one of the biggest stakeholder groups you can ever imagine. But there's a much deeper reason why I work with faiths as well. And it is because faith leaders speak the language of hope, joy, and redemption. And that is something that has been missing in the environmental science world for some time. And for those of us who have been grappling with environmental and climate issues, we often find ourselves having to grapple with despair. I mean, we all know why, right? Over 1 million species are on the verge of extinction today. I recently read that only 3% of the Earth's land surface can be considered ecologically intact anymore. Right now, even as the UN IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, are meeting in Egypt, we are fully on course for global warming at 2.7 degrees centigrade. And so we are nowhere near where we need to be right now. We need everybody to care. We need trusted ambassadors to convince not just communities or individuals that belong to those communities to care about creation care and climate change, but also to act, right? To show up as examples, to lead the behavior change. And this is where the church comes in. Faiths matter. In the United States, 9 out of 10 Americans, poll after poll, run by Pew, say that they believe in God. That number is significantly higher. Imagine, 9 out of 10 Americans. In Africa, it's way more higher than that. The creation care movement in the US and around the world is critically important to the environmental and climate movement. These are not two separate movements. They are just two facets of the same movement. Well, when I say what is creation care, let me take a moment. Creation care refers to the stewardship of God's creation and is a clear biblical command and an integral part of the gospel. Now, I should take a moment to say I'm a Buddhist. I'm a raised Buddhist. I grew up in the Himalayas. I learned this thanks to my pastor, Reverend Ed Brown, sitting over there. Given how polarized our societies are and how conflict-laden these issues have become, the Loka Initiative and Care of Creation, which is headed by Reverend Ed Brown, began hosting faith leaders, church leaders from around the world in 2020 as part of a project that we called Creation at the Crossroads. And our aim was just to make sure that pastors were in dialogue with one another, were in dialogue with scientists and experts, and felt supported in what they did. This week, we have 18 church leaders here, church pastors, among yourselves, on campus that have been meeting with UW scientists and experts to discuss, again, how we work together. How do we protect creation, right? How do we protect life on Earth? Our speakers tonight make up some of the experts from this convening. We have 3 speakers that will each speak for 10 minutes, followed by a roundtable discussion, and then a Q&A session with you. Please use your mobiles to ask your questions. I'm going to introduce all 3 speakers and then invite them one at a time to come up. Our first speaker is Jonathan Patz. He is the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor. He teaches health and environment at Nelson Institute and the Department of Population Health Sciences. For 15 years, Jonathan has served as a lead author of the UN IPCC reports and was part of the team that won the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore. He also co-chaired the health expert panel of the US National Assessment on Climate Change, a report that's mandated by the US Congress. Our second speaker is Reverend Dave Bookless. Dave is the Director of Theology for Arosha International. Arosha is a global family of Christian organizations across more than 20 countries engaging in nature conservation, church engagement, and environmental education. Dave co-leads the global Lausanne World Evangelical Alliance Creation Care Network, and as an ordained Anglican minister serves in a multi-ethnic church in London, England. He has a PhD from Cambridge on biblical theology and biodiversity conservation. Our last speaker is Dr. Janelle Curry. Janelle is the new executive director of the American Scientific Affiliation. She is a visionary and strategic leadership executive with an established record of building a mission-centered and forward-looking institutional culture that focuses on measured effectiveness. She has expertise in conflict mitigation and has extensive cross-cultural and international experience on thriving in diverse and intercultural contexts and forming cross-cultural partnerships. So I'm going to start by inviting Jonathan up. And then I think the question that we asked Jonathan to answer was, give me a second, I have too many pieces of paper up here. There we go. So the question we asked Jonathan to answer was, what type of public health crises and humanitarian needs should communities of faith be prepared for in the coming decade?
Thank you, Tequila, and it is an honor to be speaking here with Loka, with you and the other panelists. I'll just ask all of you in the audience, when you think of climate change, which we now need to call the climate crisis, what do you think comes to people's minds? They think about polar bears, for example. And I think, your question about public health is one of the most important things to realize is that the climate crisis is a health emergency. Climate change is not just about polar bears, it's about affecting all species and especially our species. And there are many reasons why we're extremely concerned about the climate crisis. When you think about climate change, we think about heat waves, extreme heat waves, but also remember that hot air holds more moisture, so you get extremes of the water cycle, so floods, droughts, and fires. And those physical attributes of climate change affect our health through several routes of exposure. So not only the heat waves, but also thinking about stagnant air masses and the effect that longer springtime and summertime has on ragweed pollen exposure. So airborne issues. And if we have flooding, we have contamination of water. So thinking about not just temperature, but also extremes of the water cycle. And there are, in Wisconsin, we're seeing 7 inches more rainfall than we did many decades ago, and it's causing flood contamination and big problems there. Of course, globally, thinking about droughts and the effect of crop failures and increasing in plant pathogens, our health depends on adequate food supplies. So the extent that climate change will affect malnutrition is pretty well documented, and it's quite scary. Some of you may have heard of CO2 fertilization. Well, plants may grow more with more CO2 in the atmosphere, but the studies show that you may have leafier vegetables, but far less protein in them. So there's an issue, broad scale, with the food system. And finally, what I think might be the iceberg under the tip of the iceberg is forced population migration. People forced to move because of extremes in weather and the civil unrest that can cause, as happened in Syria. The civil war was preceded by the worst drought in the instrumental record. And the rates of migration from rural to urban areas when farmers were coming in because of crop failures was 5 times more than normal. There were food price shocks, riots in the street. I think that this issue of forced migration could be enormous. So faith communities need to be aware of climate change as a health emergency. And especially when you think about poor communities, because there's also an equity issue. And in a heat wave, in an urban area where you get hotter temperatures, it's called the urban heat island effect, with a heat wave over a city where you might have black asphalt roads and concrete buildings that absorb the heat. Well, imagine poor communities that may have no trees or parks and plenty of roads and concrete versus a wealthier neighborhood. And it does turn out, if you put a satellite infrared image of a city during a heat wave, you see hot spots all over a city. And guess what? They're the poorest communities. So there's an equity challenge there. There's also, I mentioned heat and extremes in the water cycle. There's a problem with flooding. And guess who's most at risk to flooding? Which neighborhoods? How many of you have heard the expression, well, it's not an expression. How many of you know the reality, the historical reality of red line zoning in the United States? So red line zones are the most at risk for flooding. So faith communities, I think, have a real, there's a real need to step up and recognize the inequity of the risks that the climate crisis poses, especially to challenged neighborhoods, and even financial strain, thinking about cooling demand and the need for electricity for air conditioning. There are many families that can't afford to turn on the AC, and so there's a risk there, financial risk, thinking about that need. I'll just wrap this up by saying that the World Health Organization and the National Academy of Medicine have put climate change as #1 risk to health. So these are, pretty high-level organizations where they've really seen climate change as the threat of our lifetimes right now. But speaking of the threat of our lifetime, there's also, whenever you have a crisis, you have an opportunity. And I think there's a big role for faith communities to understand that there's an emergency need to transition away from dirty energy. And as we go through this energy transition, that faith communities need to be involved for many reasons. First, I'll say we should celebrate the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest legislation on climate change in U.S. history, $379 billion over the next 10 years, investing in the energy transition to get away from fossil fuels. And so recognize this as a golden opportunity for health, thinking about reduced air pollution, for example, when we get to clean energy, designing cities for people, not just for cars, so more active travel and better exercise for people, golden opportunity for health. But there's going to be a need for, #1, translating these benefits to your communities to help disseminate that information, that these are golden opportunities to seize upon. One of our participants, Kyle, was talking earlier today about many churches not even recognizing that they can have half of their investments in green energy, like putting solar panels on roofs, that can be paid for by the government now. That didn't used to be that way. So there are some golden opportunities to seize upon. But within your communities, understand that people will benefit disproportionately, and that it's going to be extremely important for these incentives for clean energy to reach everyone, and that everyone in your communities take advantage and recognize that this is a new day when, for example, solar energy is the cheapest way to generate electricity compared to any other source of power, to take advantage of that and to take advantage of the incentives. And finally, I'll say that we need to embrace this clean energy transition and recognize that there are more jobs in clean energy than in fossil fuel energy, but there will be a need for smooth transition, and there'll be many families that will need to be supported. And my feeling is that, yes, we cannot burn coal anymore, but we must invest in coal communities and help them through the transition. There will be there will be many people that will have to be helped along this transition. And I think faith communities will have a big role in getting everyone through this energy transition smoothly. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to invite Dave to come up. The question we've asked Reverend Dave Bookless is, how have you seen churches explore and live out creation care as a biblical principle? And as a theologian, what is your vision for the body of Christ to express care for all of creation?
Thank you, Tequila, and it's great to be with you here this evening, although I feel a little bit like a fraud here as an Englishman here in Madison. 12 years ago, the biggest conference of evangelical Christians in history took place in Cape Town, South Africa, the Lausanne Third Congress. And out of that came a document which included the phrase, "Creation care is a gospel issue within the lordship of Jesus Christ." Creation care is a gospel issue within the lordship of Jesus Christ. And that's really significant. Creation care is not simply a response to the crisis that we have been hearing about and which surrounds us on every side. Creation care is not just a woke issue for those who want to be on the latest bandwagon. Creation care is a gospel issue, and therefore it goes right to the heart of Christian faith and should therefore be at the heart of every local Christian community, every church. I shared with the group of pastors we were talking about this week the idea of the mission that churches should be involved in as a bit like the 5 fingers of your hand. If you want to grab your hand and have a look at it, and imagine that those 5 fingers represent evangelism, talking about Jesus, making disciples, helping people grow and learn and develop in their faith, compassion, caring for those on the margins, justice, responding to the inequalities we find in our world, and creation care. All things that we find deeply within the Bible. But sadly, many of our churches only focus on 1 or 2 of those, depending on their traditions. It's a bit as if we only ever used 2 of our fingers on any one of our hands. If churches are engaged in all 5, they will be far more effective, far more able to represent what it means to be the body of Christ, which is, of course, the chief image in the New Testament of what the church is, representing Jesus here on earth by being the body of Christ. And over the last 12 years, since that Cape Town conference, which made that statement, I've been privileged to be part of a movement that has seen that begin to happen with churches around the world. And we who've been helping lead that movement, myself and Ed Brown and others, haven't been responsible for this. What we're seeing is that God has gone ahead and is working amongst Christians on every continent and in every part of the world to do this. We've had 13 different conferences in different regions of the world, from Australia to Jamaica, from Peru to Croatia, from France and the US to Ghana, South Africa, and just last month, the final conference of this series in Jordan, where we brought together leaders from across the Middle East and North Africa. We've had leaders from 140 different countries, Christian leaders, take part in these conferences, looking at what the Bible has to say about caring for God's world, looking at the issues that we face, the climate crisis, the crisis of biodiversity loss, the crisis of pollution and waste, the crisis of our consumer cultures, the crisis of human health that we just heard about. And we're seeing a whole range of different responses to that. If we had time, I could use the whole evening to share with you examples. Colleagues of mine who work for Arusha, the organization I work with, on the coast of northern Kenya, where there's an area of forest, the Dakacha forest, that has been threatened with logging and with sugarcane plantations. But now Arusha is working with local communities there to have sustainable livelihoods involved with the forestry and to protect the habitat of species that would otherwise be threatened with extinction. Species like the wonderfully named golden-rumped elephant shrew, which is about the size of a badger. But if we take the Bible seriously, it's a creature that God made and God looked at and said, it's very good. A creature that God included on the ark. Why? Simply so that its kind might continue upon the earth. And if that was God's wish, what right do we have to drive it towards extinction? Or I could share with you stories of 8 different Christian groups in the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the most war-torn and troubled countries in Africa. 8 different groups of Christians working in different parts of that country, all engaged in trying to protect the natural environment in a country where huge mining corporations and warlords often cause massive problems. Or I could talk to you within my own country, the UK, about a program called Eco Church, which my colleagues in Arusha, UK, launched less than 7 years ago. And it's an online program. You do a questionnaire to work out what your church is already doing in 5 areas, looking at your worship and teaching, looking at the building you use, the energy it uses, the consumables, looking at the land, if you look after any land as a church, looking at your engagement in the local community and in global mission, and looking at the lifestyles of your church members. And once you've done that questionnaire, you can work towards getting an Eco Church award, a bronze award, which is deliberately pretty easy to get, a silver award, which is a lot more challenging, and a gold award, which is really tough. Now, we hoped when that was launched nearly 7 years ago that within 10 years, we might get to 1,000 churches in the UK. That seemed pretty ambitious. Somebody said 2,000. We thought, whoa, don't joke. We're less than 7 years in, and currently just over 5,500 churches in the UK are registered as eco churches, and more than 2,000 have already reached their bronze award. So we are seeing a global movement here as Christians are finally waking up to something that was always there in the Bible, that has always been part of the understanding of Christian faith. Sadly, we in the West, in Europe and North America, kind of lost touch with this somewhere around the time of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. We kind of boxed off our faith into a private box that said, this is just about me and God, me and Jesus. And the rest of the world can go to wherever. But actually, if we look back at the Bible, the very first Great Commission, the very first Great Commandment, is the one that God gives to every human being of every faith or none in Genesis chapter 1. To all those, male and female, made in the image of God. The first commandment, to rule over the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea. And rule over does not mean to dominate, destroy, exploit, rape, pillage, and selfishly abuse. It means to rule over as God would. The God who has just created this extraordinary biodiverse world and says, it is good, it is good, it is all very good. Who entrusts it to our care, not to use for our own sakes, but to use to glorify God. And it's my prayer and it's my dream that churches in the States, which are already in many places beginning to pick up this vision, do so more and more. That this goes viral here, just as it seems to have done in the UK. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dave. Dr. Janelle Curry, the question that we asked her to respond to is, as we are mandated to love God and our neighbor and to steward the world, What strategies can we in the church use to advance loving and fruitful conversations about creation care across ideological lines?
So, what I'm going to do is spend some time talking to you about how you would imagine working within a church towards joint actions together towards care of creation. And I want to ask you to step back and rather than thinking about creation care alone, think about how can you engage your congregation in change in a way that builds capacity as an institution. Because really, creation care is about building right relationships with each other, with the earth, and with God. So how do you invest in a process that enriches the life of the church as a body? So I would argue that the way to do this is to take your time and to lay the groundwork and think about where you're going and what the goal is in building that capacity. So consult broadly, and I would even suggest go and have coffee with those that you think might be your opponents to anything you want to do. Talk to the board and get ideas from them. And just remember that you sense the urgency, but others aren't there yet. And so give them time to come along and give them time to think about where you need to go. They need time to absorb and think. Build a strategy that's based on those consultations and start listening for what the common interests are that might cross the boundaries of ideological divides. And I would encourage holding on to your goals loosely while you listen to other people. Go back then. Once you've done your listening and you've constructed a strategy, then go back and try out your strategy with all these same people. And what we call workshop it. Have them tell you why it won't work. And listen to what they're talking about and identify where the roadblocks are. And then take time again, and this is a long process, to make sure you start well and you know where you're going and you have had all the conversations that you need to have. Then I would encourage taking time to work on messaging as you enter the plan with the entire congregation. Present a message of wholeness, not of division, but rather that vision of shalom about what is possible. What does thriving look like? What does flourishing look like? And through that, align your own goals with the language of the institution and what they care about. Shalom, the biblical principles you're working out of, and also the process and how important the process is in order to achieve your goals. Work hard to have consistent, clear messaging with that language that aligns the culture. And if you've done your listening well, you'll find out where the passions of the congregation are. Are they in missions? Then tie some of your actions and your goals to the issue of missions. Is it to local poverty? And we've just heard descriptions of the connection between climate change and local poverty. I grew up in a church where there are many people who loved hunting and fishing. And many of those people also were incredibly attuned to the local environment. So again, the opportunity to tie into the passions that are already there. And look to see if there's some person from the past that's very beloved and honored that had the kinds of traits that you want to nurture, and pull out the image of that person for everybody in the congregation and build on that image of that person who nurtured the congregation. Then I would suggest give people concrete things to do. Ideally, some should be concrete and visible and require communal work and eating together. And I think that that's eating together. It's very hard to have ideological divides when you're eating together and doing communal work. Remember all along that you are building long-term change and resilience. So you have to have patience, not a quick fix. Other challenges will come too. So think about how the process of implementing change can build abilities to tackle other problems along the way. And I'm a social scientist. Collect data, right? Collect data so that you can measure success and translate the data into something people can grasp, and make sure you celebrate every success, no matter how small. Only go one step at a time. Even if you have lots of goals and ideas in the back of your mind, always be listening to what resonates with the people who are around you and are engaged, in order to have that sort of shape what you do next. So it's listening to the Spirit. What is God doing in the midst of the congregation? And what are they saying to you? And that will tell you what the next step should be. So I call that practicing improvisation and giving up your goal for what God might do. And always remind everyone where you've come from, where you're going, why you're going there, and do it all the time, not just once. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Janelle. So I'm going to kick us off with a short moderated conversation, and then we're going to open it up to everybody. The first question I have is slightly personal. All three of you come from very different backgrounds and paths, but we're all here together. And so what I'd love to know is, what motivated you to do the work you do today? What was your path that brought you here?
Well, so my background is medical, and I very early on felt that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and a stitch in time saves nine, and that environmental influences were understudied and majorly important. And in my medical training, when I would see patients come in and realize that there was so much more that could happen outside of the medical setting, in their local environment. What is their job? Are they exposed to dangerous substances? Are they living in a city that has air pollution? Are they living in a city where it's not safe to bicycle and not getting enough exercise? And to me, I saw the upstream determinants extremely important. So I pretty early on dedicated myself to prevention, and then recognizing that the determining factors of population-wide health were many of them were environmental. I embraced the prevention area of environmental public health. And then when I was doing my master's in public health, along with my environmental and occupational medicine residency, I saw climate change as a huge topic related to air pollution, population, and it was not being studied much. and I sort of dove in. And then the rest I'll just leave for later.
Yeah, sure. Being a pastor, I've got 3 points all beginning with the same letter. So firstly, a real sense of call that God called me into this. If you'd asked me 30 years ago, I'd have kind of scratched my head and go, what? I thought I was just going to be a pastor of an ordinary church. And that was it. And then God challenged me very directly while I was on vacation and not expecting it. He caught me off guard. And basically, it was looking at an area of trash that had been thrown on what had once been a beach on a beautiful little island. And I sensed God say, and it wasn't a voice from the sky, but a deep inner sense of God saying, how do you think I feel about what you're doing to my world? And that question turned my life around. Because it brought together the fact that we live in an amazing and beautiful world, and God cared about how I treated it. So for me, that sense of call, and what that did was it drove me back to the Bible to reread passages that I thought I understood, and I discovered I'd often missed a lot of what was there, like John 3:16. God so loved the world, and it's in the Greek it's cosmos. God so loved the cosmos that he sent his only son. So my second C is conviction. So call, conviction. And then thirdly, the more I read about it, the more I talked to my scientist friends, the crisis. And thinking about what kind of planet I was going to be leaving for my children and hopefully one day grandchildren. So those three things, call, conviction, and crisis.
I'm not sure I have a 3-point sermon, so I have to follow him. I grew up in a strip mine coal area in Illinois. And I think from a young age, I just grieved over the destruction of the beautiful farmland. And from early on, I was asking questions about not only that, but the health of the town that I grew up in, which was a factory town that had very high unemployment. So I think it's been more a journey of trying to figure out what does shalom look like? The wholeness of all those relationships. And then that drove me into the field of geography. And of course, then that includes climatology. And so it goes into climate change. So how important or how crucial climate change is a factor for keeping us from building healthy, flourishing communities that have right relationships so it's more of that image of what's possible, and this as a factor that's really keeping us from that.
Thank you. The second question I have for all of you is, what are common misconceptions people have about your individual work? How can we combat these and communicate more effectively? We can mix it up. Maybe we start with Janelle this time.
So a lot of my academic work, I would say, deals with the misconceptions of Christians by scientists and other people, in that they're a very homogeneous group, when actually they're very diverse. They all come from different backgrounds. So I think the nuance of the Christian community, the reality of that, is something that people really misunderstand.
Shall I go next? Okay. I've become quite a keen birder as time has gone on. And so one of the misconceptions is that my work with Arosha and getting to travel to different places to speak is just an excuse to go birding in lots of different countries and on different continents, I do enjoy that, but it's a misconception. That's my reason for doing it. I think more seriously, there's a misconception that creation care is just an optional extra. It's for kind of those who are keen on that kind of thing. If you're into gardening, or you're into biodiversity conservation, or whatever, then that's okay. You do your thing, I'll do my thing. But actually, for Christians, it's about being a disciple of Jesus Christ. And if Jesus is Lord of all creation, then it's not an optional extra. It's part of the core curriculum.
Yeah, I'd say for me, the biggest misconception is that health is about hospitals and healthcare, when really health is about healthy communities, um, healthy air, water, ecosystems that support biodiversity and support plant our food systems. And so I think that I'm not the one that has come up with the idea that we have built, at least in our country, a sick care system instead of a health care system. I think this is where, that health really is much broader than what we think it is. And that when I talk to people about the most important health policies, the most important health policies are energy policy, transportation policy and urban planning, food system policy, conservation. Those are extremely important, and taking that systems view of health is what I think is so important and not understood enough.
Thank you. So, what brought all three of you here was this project that we initiated, a week-long conversation between pastors, scientists, and experts. And so, my question to each one of you is now going to start with Jonathan. Jonathan, as a secular scientist, why do you want to talk to faith leaders?
Well, I can't tell you how timely and urgent it is to talk to faith leaders right now when there is complete disregard for science. Science is not trusted by many and so there is a lot of intentional disinformation all over the place. And as well as scientists can communicate, which in many cases is not very well, but even for good communicating scientists, their messages are not necessarily carrying weight and not trusted. And so we need to, as a scientist, I feel like I need help from other communities of trusted voices, like, doctors and nurses are trusted voices, and faith leaders are trusted voices. And I think this is where we need to have that faith leaders help us communicate true what we know is, as science is, we always have uncertainties, but where we have relative certainty to act, we need help with communicating the science and in a truthful way by trusted messengers. So for me, it's so vital, and the partnership is really important.
Dave, as a theologian, how do you build a connection with science?
I find what Jonathan shared, it resonates, but I find it deeply sad that there's this mistrust of science. And it's something that, living on the other side of the pond, I think we look at as how on earth did that happen? Because we don't have quite that disconnect in Europe as is here in parts of North America. For me, science is understanding the world that God has made. It's good science is simply thinking God's thoughts after him. It's exploring what God has made, asking intelligent questions about it, and discovering about it. That's what good science should be doing. And, very simplistically, faith answers the how questions. No, wrong way around. Faith answers the why questions. Science answers the how questions. It's a bit simplistic, but it's broadly true. Science tells us an awful lot about how things happen, how the world works. Faith tries to give us an answer as to why. And so, to me, these absolutely are vital to work together.
Janelle, as the new director for the American Scientific Affiliation, how do you connect the worlds of faith and science?
Well, the American Scientific Affiliation is an association of Christians who are in the sciences. So speaking for the association as well, we don't see that there's a conflict. So it's really a safe space for scientists to come together to explore the glory of the creation and how it works while having a deep faith that maybe answers the why question. But also I see these as mutually enriching because they lead to a deepening, both together lead to a deepening awe at what the Creator has made, which is far larger than all of anything we can imagine. So there's really no reason to have fear over asking questions because it's incredible. So,
Thank you. So the last question I have for our roundtable is, what gives you hope? I'm going to start with Dave, Jonathan, and then end with Janelle. How about that?
Well, Dakila, you and I share several things in common, but one is that we were both born in India. And one of my great secret hobbies is watching Bollywood movies. And there's a Bollywood movie called Salame-Ishq, in which there's a character, I won't give away the plot or anything, but there's a character who has this bizarre dream of one day meeting this beautiful girl and getting married. And when everyone laughs at him and tells him how ridiculous this is, he just says, just wait. It's a fact of future truth. It's a fact of future truth. And when I first heard that phrase in this Bollywood movie, my kind of theological antennae just kind of pricked up, because it's the best definition of Christian hope that I've ever heard. It's a fact of future truth. The evidence may point the opposite way. The evidence points that we are going to wreck this planet and we are going to leave an almost unlivable world for our grandchildren unless we change things very fast. And sadly, the evidence is that most people just seem to prefer to bury their heads in the sand rather than do that. So without my Christian faith, I would despair. But because I believe in a God who's committed to creation, because I believe in Jesus and that he died and rose again, and that one day he will come back to restore and renew this earth, that gives me hope and the motivation to do something about that now, to be part of the hope that is going to come.
So what gives me hope? Greta Thunberg and the youth movement, who are energizing and, charging, really demanding change and real action. Seeing real action finally happen and having the passage of the largest climate change legislation in history, in US history anyway. I think anyway, world history. Yeah. And to see that actually happen, and industry waking up and saying, what? Solar prices have dropped 300-fold in the last 40 years, and the cheapest way to generate electricity, if you remove all subsidies, is now renewables? Like, wow, we are in a new place. We don't have to wait for a magic bullet or new technology. So we've got incredible energy from the youth movement. We're in a technological space where we're not waiting for anything new. It's here. And we finally are getting political will, some traction. And, from my own health realm, I see the climate crisis as the largest health opportunity of our lifetimes. And we've added up the numbers. Air pollution kills 7 million people a year. Unhealthy food systems, 11 million. Over-reliance on motor vehicles, 4 million. That's 24 million deaths every year. That's half of all deaths every year if we could get to a low-carbon economy across energy, transportation, and food systems. Oh my gosh, a low-carbon economy is so healthy. Eureka. I mean, so I view the action on climate crisis as really the biggest opportunity of our times from the point of view of health. And as far as looking at youth movement and finally legislation, I'm actually quite hopeful.
I think as a person of faith, I feel like we ought to be able to look at honestly at the brokenness, yet still have hope, just because we have hope in Christ. And I think for me, is seeing the pattern of hope or change coming out of brokenness. So I thought I would read you a poem that is one I keep on my phone, and every once in a while I'll just go read it. It's called The Hardest Blessing. If we cannot lay aside the wound, then let us say it will not always bind us. Let us say the damage will not eternally determine our path. Let us say the line of our life will not always travel along the places we are torn. Let us say that forgiveness can take some practice, can take some patience, can take a long and struggling time. Let us say that to offer the hardest blessing, we will need the deepest grace, that to forgive the sharpest pain, we will need the fiercest love, that to release the ancient ache, we will need new strength for every day. Let us say the wound will not be our final home, that through it runs a road, a way we would not have chosen, but on which we will finally see forgiveness, so long practiced, coming toward us, shining with the joy so well deserved. Amen.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, all three of you. That was wonderful. I'm going to open it up. All of you have your phones with you. I hope you've been sending in questions. And I think it can be, is that? Yes.
So, regarding sending in questions, there was a setup error. So, if you tried to submit a question in the beginning and it wasn't working, it's not your fault. It was our fault. So the QR code will work now, and you should like see a question box. Dan, if you can put that QR code back up. Oh, sorry. Just put it up there briefly, so to make sure that people can get the link, and then more people can. But this is what the questions will look like. Does anyone need the QR code again? Raise your hand, or anybody? You got it? Well, somebody in the back. It's at the top. Oh, great. You can just go to polev.com/upper house. Awesome. Okay, here you go.
Great. All right. People start submitting, start voting. It looks like the first one we're going to ask is Jonathan. How do you wish local churches in Madison were engaging on climate change and creation care?
Well, I wish that local churches in Madison would herald the success of the city of Madison. Madison is very green oriented, and celebrate the fact that we are a platinum ranked city for bikeability, and that the mayor of Madison is part of a national network of mayors that are working on climate change. There is the Mayor's Innovation Project. So Madison has a lot to be proud of, and I think that local churches should use the city of Madison as an example for other cities to engage in climate change. So I'd say use Madison as an example. And also, don't forget, as Kyle reminded us this morning in a session, that the incentives and tax breaks coming out from the Inflation Reduction Act, they're going to be huge. So go ahead, and now it's time to put the solar panels on the roof.
So the second question that's come up is, what does it look like to build trust across faith and science divides? And I think that's all three of you can answer that. But I feel like, how do you diffuse hostility, Janelle? That question in particular, I think is for
I
you.
think the only way to diffuse hostility is through relationship building. And there are many ways, strategies, and we spent part of the morning looking at some of those strategies. But I think it's scientists knowing people in the faith community and building personal relationships that have integrity and honesty so that they can communicate and ask questions. One of the things I've thought about with the American Scientific Affiliation is proposing an adopt a scientist for churches, as a pastor. But actually, there are scientists in churches, and I encourage pastors and scientists in the churches to build a better relationship so that the pastors have people to go to and ask questions to. So that's just a couple comments.
Yeah.
Catherine Hayhoe, who's an evangelical climate scientist. And one thing that she says is important is to disrupt bad narratives. So my favorite line from her, she's asked, so do you believe in climate change? Her answer is absolutely not. I don't believe in climate change. It's not a belief. I'm a scientist. Science is, it's real, they're facts. So disrupting narratives when you need to.
Because the next question is for you. How did the Christian faith turn from loving the planet to conquering the planet?
Yeah, it's a good question. And what I like about the question is that it recognizes that the Christian faith started by loving the planet, because it did. And through most of the first 1,500 years of the Christian faith, there was a strong relationship between Christian faith and creation care, although that language is modern. So look at the Celtic Christian movement in Europe, look at the Franciscans, look at the Benedictines, actually look at the forefathers of the Evangelical movement, both in North America and in Europe. So the same people who helped abolish slavery in Europe, Evangelical Christians, also founded the world's first animal protection organization, and so on and so on. But what went wrong? I think it was in many ways, and there's lots to say on this, but keeping it simple, the battle between science and faith that for many Christians started with Darwin meant that this mistrust of science grew. And at the same time, Christians in both North America and Western Europe kind of just went with their cultures at the time of the Industrial Revolution, at the time of the Enlightenment, which started seeing nature just as inanimate resources to be exploited rather than as something that had value and that was, in some sense, sacred because God had made it. It just became stuff that we could do what we like with, natural resources. And if we just see it as natural resources, then we exploit it. If we see it as something sacred because God made it, then we care for it. So I think that's where we started to go wrong. And I think over the last few decades, we've begun to see a recovery of what always was there.
All right. Lots of tweets. So I'm going to go with, there are so many opportunities for Christians to engage in creation care. Where do you suggest people begin? So maybe something like first few steps for someone that's just starting out, right, as Christians, and maybe it's new, trying to think through how do they develop it for their church. What would you suggest?
I would probably say to start by looking at your own practices. At the same time, you look for some communal expression locally, at least as a start. So one would be your energy. Where do you use your energy, or even making small changes in terms of how much you drive your car? Walk instead. And we just heard about waste. Reduce your food waste. which is a huge component. So what are the ways you shop? And so to change the way you live, maybe to pay more attention to what's around you and what you're doing, as well as some joint action with others.
I agree with everything that Janelle just said. I think I'd just add to that. If you're a preacher, if you're a minister, then start preaching about it. Start studying the Bible and start including that in your regular menu of speaking. You'll find almost every page in the Bible has something to say of relevance to creation care once you start looking. And I'll say, whoever you are, whether you're a pastor or whether you're an ordinary member of a church, start praying about these issues. Turn it into your prayer life, internalize it, and then you'll find that actually the Holy Spirit begins to plant ideas about what you're going to do practically. And for different ones of us, it might be starting in different places. You know, it might be that you're at the stage of thinking about starting a family, and it might be what kind of diapers you're going to use. That's a very practical one. It might be you're thinking of getting a vehicle. It might be about getting an electric vehicle or getting a hybrid vehicle or getting an e-bike. So I think depending on what stage of life we're at, it can be very different places. But one thing I would really encourage all churches to do and all people to do is go outdoors. Start enjoying God's creation. You know, during COVID times when we couldn't do much else, in many parts of the world, and certainly where I lived, you were allowed to go outside as long as you didn't mix with people. And that's what kept people sane. And it helped people reconnect with the natural world, recognize its beauty, its resilience, and its specialness. So to me, that's such an obvious place to be. Get outdoors. Yeah.
A bird book and a tree book and go look and put your phone down.
I'm going to have to fill in the blanks for this question. It seems like many events geared towards exploring creation care and climate change tend to attract the choir. Oh, there we go. How can church or science communities mainstream these topics to include more people?
I think actually I'm going to pick up something Janelle said when she was speaking earlier, which is I think find the issues that are already issues for people in your church. So, you know, I live in a very urban, quite economically deprived part of London. It's a very multiracial community. If you start talking about climate change, most people kind of just go, that's stuff we see on television. It won't relate to them. If you start talking about air pollution and respiratory diseases amongst children, people connect because they see that. If you start talking about trash on the streets and the problem with rats that there is in our local community, people see that and they want to do something about it. So find the issues that connect to where people are actually at. Scratch where they're itching to begin with, and kind of work outwards from there. So I'm sure there's lots more that could be said, but that would be.
Maybe it's that you don't necessarily name it as climate change, like Jonathan talking about, you know, urban poverty, you know, the challenge, all the public health issues of the poor, which are clear mandates for Christians to care about, are all interconnected. So you don't have to even talk about climate change. It's all part of a whole.
Many audiences, if you start with climate change, you've lost the audience. And I've given many lectures where I don't even say the words climate change. And it's easy to talk about, you know, extreme storms. It's easy, as you said, scratch the itch, you know, their itch, you know. So talking to fishermen about trout and, you know, the warming rivers in Wisconsin, the trout populations are in trouble. And so those communities where they, you know, fishers may be outside of the choir in many ways, and to talk about, to meet people where they are, as you've said, Janelle, and understand what they care about. And I do think I have a bias that I think there's more common ground around the health topic related to climate change compared to the environment. So I think there's more common ground with health, but I also think getting to the local concerns, knowing where people are, and being able to listen and relate to what they care about. And to be willing to give a lecture without using the words climate change at the beginning.
Yeah. That's where the Evangelical Environmental Network talks about it being a pro-life issue. You know, when you talk about the health of children and pollution and all of those things, that's an issue of life.
My favorite entry point is disasters for precisely that reason. All right. What unique thing can faith communities bring to the table in our fight against climate change?
I would say they have the potential for having that integrated view of the world in terms of community, care for the poor, flourishing of communities, commitment to communities, and appreciation for what God has created. So it has that potential.
I was going to say that, but I'll
Sorry.
I'll say a tiny bit more on hope, because I think that's another thing that and there's a difference between hope and optimism. You know, optimism is kind of cross your fingers and hope it's going to work out okay, but hope is something deeper and more profound. And there was a survey done by Edinburgh University looking at the websites of secular environmental organizations and Christian environmental organizations, just doing word clouds on the significant terms that came up. And what was so interesting was that the secular NGOs, Friends of the Earth, WWF, etc., it tended to be a lot about fear and threat and danger. And the Christian ones talked about urgency, but they also talked about hope and neighbors and creation care. And so it was both more integrated, but it was also more hopeful, the narrative that was there. So I hope that's something that faith communities can bring.
Just relating to that, I once had a summer as a community organizer, and one of the people in the organization said that the faith communities were the ones that persisted in working with them because they didn't give up. And I think it's that element of hope that you're talking about.
Dave, what is the name of the environmental ranking system for the churches, the eco churches?
It's just called Eco Church. Do Google it. At the moment, it's only within the UK, but we are looking at ways of developing that. We'd have to change the questionnaires to make it work in different contexts, but we're looking at ways of doing that to make it more globally useful.
I see a question on consumerism that I would love to pull out. Okay. Consumerism is one of the biggest reasons for the environmental issues that we are experiencing. I love this question. In today's world, a successful life is marked by what an individual accumulates throughout their lifetime. How can church and faith leaders guide the community towards a non-materialistic world?
Wow.
Whoever asked that question, we like you.
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things that really struck me when I was doing a Bible study on Jeremiah 29, which is words where God speaks to the people of Israel in exile in Babylon. So they're in a strange foreign city where they don't really want to be, and you wouldn't think they'd be interested in the well-being of that place. And God says to them, to paraphrase, put down roots and care for the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've called you. And I looked at the meaning of that word prosperity. And here's, our modern Western consumer-driven understanding of prosperity means I get rich and I don't care about what happens to you. A biblical understanding of prosperity is that I cannot be rich if my neighbor is poor. So it's not individualistic, it's communal. So prosperity is something you can only define in your relationships with others. And that includes actually your relationships with the non-human world as well. So humans cannot be prosperous if they are destroying the environment that they live in. So we somehow have to just get out of our individualistic bubbles where we think that having more stuff makes you happier, which is the lie that advertising gives all the time, and where we realize that actually what really matters and what really makes us prosperous is our relationships.
Do either of you want to add anything? Any thoughts?
Just to affirm that it's about relationships
Mm.
and the richness of relationships that give us meaning.
Mm.
A corollary to this, which is that I think part of this is in the inference of giving up or not to own so much or not to consume so much, that, you know, in many ways, there is there's simplicity. You don't have to give up necessarily. You know, yes, we should not consume as much, but I think the idea that sacrifice, we need to sacrifice, is something that is misguided, and that if we had better designs, I'm thinking about cities, I'm thinking about all sorts of choices, that it's actually not necessarily a sacrifice to be consuming less. And so I think that that's where that needs to change, and that's a matter of upfront design and intentionality. So I think that that to make sure that we don't confuse consumerism and not consuming as much with sacrifice, because it can be hugely enriching and beneficial, and you're not giving up anything.
One of my daughters and I lived in Hong Kong, and when we came back, people would say, "What was the best thing about Hong Kong?" And we would just go, "Mass transit." You know, that was not giving up anything. In fact, the burden was coming back and having to use a car, right? There's a richness to being on the street and experiencing that when you have good mass transit.
So there is a question on the top, which is, if I have $1,000 or $10,000 and wanted to do the most good for our environment, how should I spend it?
Donate to a rose shop.
That's a tricky question, but they're like, for example, we've learned, I mean, the most important thing we can do is vote to change things, to vote for responsible people that that care about sustainability and stewardship. So there's one thing, and then, you know, there are a million different layers. So there's one layer. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to give a one right answer to that question, and it will differ for different people. But I was deeply challenged when my wife's parents, who were both in their 80s, they watched a documentary on the crisis, the climate crisis, and they'd heard me speak, they'd heard lots of things, but this really convicted them. And they suddenly thought, what are we doing?
Was that my TEDx?
I confess it was something by David Attenborough instead. But they said, what's the point in us having savings and enjoying our retirement if the world that our grandchildren are going to grow up in is going to be almost unlivable? So they decided to catch in some of their savings, and they said, okay, Dave, can you advise us? Should we get an electric car because we need to get a new car anyway? Or should we put solar panels on our house? And in the end, they decided to go for the electric car for reasons I won't bother to go into. But I was really struck by them saying, you know, what kind of world do we want to leave to our grandchildren? Do we want to leave the possibility that we might be able to give them something in our wills? What's the point in that if the world is going to be unlivable? Let's invest in their future by spending some money now.
I would say it should be more than 10,000. It should be everything that you own that you're making a decision towards sustainability.
Okay, perfect segue into this question. How do we move beyond a scarcity mentality to one of abundance?
I just always think of climate change challenge as one that puts boundaries around us, that allows us to be more creative, so that it's not about, I'm with Jonathan, it's not about sacrifice, it's about living differently. That's actually a better way to live anyway. So how do we, the question would be how to change the narrative to give people that experience so that they understand that. I don't know if you.
This reminds me, I think I was in middle school, and I remember seeing these short videos. They were award-winning short video clips. And I remember one was about children challenged to paint pictures of utopia, a utopian environment. And all of them were different, except they had one common thing across all utopias that these children showed. There were no cars or roads. And so simply, I mean, it makes me, going back to this is an opportunity to restart, to, we're not committed to everything that we've set up now. We have a new opportunity to reinvent or redesign, and it's a fantastic turning point, and it's the pressure to do it now, because we have 8 years to cut emissions in half if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels. So it's a timely emergency, but we don't need to be locked into what we've built now, and it's fantastic opportunity to think differently and benefit from that.
Jonathan, there's a question for you. What would you say to scientists who might be afraid to work with faith leaders? And how can faith leaders help build that bridge?
Well, there's been a myth in science that an objective good scientist publishes her or his work, and it's out, just puts it out there and stays in their laboratory and does the science and keeps their mouth shut, or they're not objective good scientists. Well, that is long gone as far as that mentality. And in fact, if you think about where science is funded, it's from federal grants mostly. And, that's taxpayer money. And if taxpayers are paying scientists to do science, it's a scientist's responsibility to communicate effectively back to the public. So it's a contract. The scientists need to, it can't just sit on the shelf and let someone else interpret my science. I have an obligation to get the science and its findings and the importance of what the findings mean out to the public. So with that in mind, engaging with faith leaders is a very effective way to disseminating scientific information. And as a scientist, we have a responsibility to make that happen.
I feel like the questions keep coming and they're so great, but I think this has to be the last question. So the question I'm going to pick is, could you share an encouraging testimony of how you've worked on a challenging relationship in the area of climate change and found success? And maybe if each one of you has an example, and we can end on that hopeful note.
I'll kick off because I spotted that question and was hoping you're going to choose it. And I'm going to talk about my mother. My mother's 96 years old now, and she's still alive, but not very well, lives in a care home. When I first got into all of this, kind of nearly 30 years ago, she thought I'd totally lost the plot. She is a biblically conservative Christian, was delighted when I felt a call to get ordained and become a pastor. And then when I started talking about climate change and talking about creation care, she thought I'd gone mad, and she thought I'd just completely lost it. And she said, what's the point anyway? Because when Jesus comes back, it's all going to get burned up. So why do we need to care about the planet? So scroll forward, 30 years on, she's changed completely. Every time when I had to tell her to write down on a piece of paper, don't phone Dave this week, he's in America. But at home, every day she phones and we chat. And every day she asks me, how can I pray for you today? How can I pray for a Rocha? What are you doing about climate change? So it takes time. It takes building relationships and dealing with people's baggage, but you can get there.
I'm trying to think of a good example. Maybe I don't know if this was success, but I had been doing some talks on climate change, and I decided I really needed to go to a place that was even harder to talk about it. So I was teaching at a college at that time, and so they arranged an alumni event in the most conservative community. And I would say it was a success because I talked about it and we managed the conversation. And I think one of the things that it was one of the more hostile comments was about the free market. And I said, well, I am a supporter of the free market and free market solutions, but I don't worship the free market. And that broke the ice. It's not, so the presumptions about where I might be. And that, so I considered that successful in that we had productive engagement.
So I have a very simple story. And I shared it with Janelle because Janelle's into conflict resolution. And one of my scientific nemesis was a very prominent vector biologist in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And the idea of climate change when we've got all sorts of drugs and treatments and vaccines and why bother with this climate change stuff when we can go straight to the cures? And anyway, we always went after each other. And we were at a meeting together in Colorado, and there was a barbecue. We were out, socializing, and there was a band, and the band was on break, and I picked up the fiddle, and I'm not a good fiddler. I just want, for the record, I'm no good, but I played fiddle in a bluegrass band in medical school, and so I played a little fiddle, and this pretty conservative CDC guy came up to me and said, Jonathan, I had no idea that you played the fiddle. And from that time on, we were like that. And he didn't give me a hard time. So it was sort of just a relationship type thing, and get out of your relationships matter.
Absolutely. Also, everyone learn a musical instrument.
Jonathan, would you just like...
Anyway, so thank you so much for coming out. I hope you had as good a time as we've had on stage. And I think the last word has been relationships and the importance of building relationships. So go out and build relationships.